there is this incredibly important event which takes place, the World War I, which takes place in the midst of the largest globalization that has ever existed in history up to that moment. Why wouldn't you have economistic theory why this event has happened? But no, there is no theory. It just happens, okay, well, there is a guy who assassinated another guy in Sarajevo. That's the theory. Well, that's ridiculous. We believed that with globalization and mutual trade, the interests would be so strong that we would never go to war. Because we know that the war would be really bad for me and you. And it actually did happen. It was bad for me and you. And we knew that, and we still went to war.
Here in Novara Media, we like to talk about some of the biggest trends of the 21st century, the things that are remaking the world and probably remaking your life too. Multipolarity and the demise of an American-led world order, technological change and automation, the rise of China, demographic aging. All of these are so important, and almost all of them will be figuring in our conversation today. All of them are integrated into this fantastic new book by Branko Milanovic, The Great Global Transformation. He talks about how the Western middle class getting poorer goes hand in hand with the likes of China getting wealthier. One falls, one rises. At the same time, we have the end of history. Talk of moving to a multipolar world isn't for the future. It's happening. It's here and now. Now, we often talk about the demise of neoliberalism as if it's something that's yet to really happen. Again, Branko thinks we should be talking in the past tense, the end of history. But what comes next? Well, that's where things get super fascinating. And just to be clear, Branko has the credentials to have strong opinions on this. After all, he's a former economist at the World Bank. He's a big brain. He reads a hell of a lot. You're going to have a great time watching this over the next hour and a half. Branko Milanovic, welcome to Downstream.
Well, thank you very much, Aaron. It's a pleasure to be here.
I am so excited about this conversation. Some of the stuff we love talking about here on Downstream. The rise of China, the collapse of the West, transformations in the global economy, the decline of the Western middle class. It's all packed into your new book, The Great Global Transformation. I'm so excited because I'm a weird guy. Lots of graphs and lots of big observations. Let's start where it really matters. Why did the USSR collapse and yet China doesn't just not collapse, but thrives and becomes one of the world's leading economies after the 1990s?
You obviously want to lead with really simple questions, right? I think that the USSR collapsed because it was economically unsuccessful and because there was increasing realization of USSR falling behind in terms of welfare of the population, behind Western Europe and the West. It was only successful in the military production, but you cannot eat, actually, satellites and tanks. And then that realization, I think, percolated through the establishment. And when Gorbachev came to power, it was not an accidental event. It was an attempt to actually reboot the Soviet Union and to make it more economically successful. However, it just failed for many reasons, and it led to the breakup of the Soviet Union. And I think one of the effects of that breakup is the war that we are actually witnessing now for almost 4 years between Russia and Ukraine. So it was a disaster. On the other hand, China, as you said, was extremely successful, way more successful than anyone could have predicted. And not only anyone in the 1970s, but anyone in 1982 when the reform started, and even in 1990. And when you think of Tiananmen, what happened there, and it was a belief that actually this was the end of reforms in China, that China would kind of slide back into kind of a Maoist morass. Exactly the opposite happened. The reforms, the economic activity increased, the GDP per capita grew tremendously, and China was a great success case. So I just told the history, but of course, it's not really, I didn't touch very much on the causes of the two, but maybe we can talk about that later.
I wonder, because I start with that question leading to something else, which is, was there a road untraveled by the USSR and Eastern Europe, somewhere like the DDR, East German Republic, where very high levels of human capital, a medium income country, had they pursued a different path in the mid to late 1970s, could somewhere like the DDR, Hungary, etc., been more like the Asian tigers?
They could have actually, if you look at Poland, Poland has become an Asian tiger since the transition and since the end of communism. I think that it's always hard to argue something against against the facts which have happened. So when one argues that actually USSR, for example, could have actually moved differently, it's very hard because people say no, actually there was only one outcome. I think there were possibilities even after Stalin in the 1950s and 60s. There were possibilities to jumpstart economic development and make technologically the country more successful. I think the fall of the Soviet Union had to do with an ability to absorb and create new technology in the production, not only of consumer goods, but of the goods that matter for people's livelihood. And I think that was the key problem. And I think they realized that in the 1960s you had reforms which introduced much more market than before, but all of that was eventually not successful. And I think that the fact that when Brezhnev came to power, it was a period of stagnation, ideological, economic, and elsewhere, and in practically all domains, artistic as well. And that made life was not bad, but it really was not it's not improving. And I think that led to the huge dissatisfaction. Or to the belief, rather, that things could be different. That's a little bit different. Dissatisfaction is active dislike of something. A belief that something could be better is not an active dislike. It's actually a desire to make things more palatable, more agreeable, better.
I've heard a line which is that the USSR didn't fail in so much as it was optimized for World War III. Its economic model, its political model, everything about that particular polity was optimized to fight a conflict after 1945. And the point is that just never happened. Do you think that's just a bit of cope and wishful thinking, or?
No, it's possible. I think that actually they overestimated the importance of war because they underestimated, in some sense, I think, their power. What I want to say is the following. If you look back at the origin of the USSR, you had, from the very beginning, attempts to actually end this revolution through foreign intervention. So as you know, in the 1920, Americans, French, British, all intervened in Russia to actually stop the revolution. And I think they sort of developed a state of mind. And of course, in 1941, when Hitler invaded, they developed a state of mind, which I think is not alien to Russians even today, that somehow somebody is all the time trying to attack them. And in that state of mind, then you over-prepare, you overestimate the importance of the military. And I think in the Soviet Union, they have spent, current estimates are they're spending about 15% of GDP on the military. Had they spent that money, had they spent 5% on the military and the other 10% on something much more reasonable, I think that the dissatisfaction or unhappiness of the people would have been less.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, two people I've spoken to in the last couple of weeks. One is Vali Nasr, Iranian academic from Johns Hopkins, and another is Sergei Plokhy at Harvard.
Right.
And, you look at Iranian foreign policy, its policy of forward defense, it's rooted in a paranoia that's centuries old. The same with Russia. You can go back to Hitler, you can go back to the Civil War, you can go back to Napoleon, you can go to the Great Northern War. And I think it's something that's really lost on Brits and Americans, that these mindsets about national interest and foreign policy go back a really long time. They're very hard to get rid of. Let's go back to China for a minute. You mentioned the reforms of the early 1980s. How important is Deng Xiaoping and Dengism, and what exactly does he do to the Chinese economy?
Before I answer that, let me just go back on the previous question when you mentioned, because China is actually an interesting counterpart to the USSR. China, has built the military and has atomic bombs and all that. But I think they did not exaggerate military production the same way the Soviet Union did. Actually, once they got, I think, 300 or 400 atomic weapons, they stopped. That's enough. But the Soviet Union went for 10,000. They wanted to have a little bit more than the Americans. And why do you need 10,000 if you know you can destroy anybody with 500? So that was what I meant. Really, in some sense, irrational stuff, in my opinion. Now, how important was Deng? Well, Deng, I think it was, super important person, actually. He obviously was not designed to be Mao's successor. Hua Guofeng was the successor, but he eventually was selected by the top class. And it was also interesting, we have to admit that he was the person who decided to go with Tiananmen massacre. But then he was the person also who in 1992 went for this southern tour, which actually after the retrenchment of Tiananmen and political retrenchment and more left-wing policies, after 1992, actually the situation went back to the very pro-market oriented, pro-rich, pro-rich people, actually, as he said, being rich is glorious. So he had, there is no doubt, I think it's incontestable that he had a super important role in China. So if you take, it was a Mao time and then there was a Deng time.
Do you think he died a Marxist? You know, when you read the biographies and so on, they say Deng died a committed Marxist. The project was to unleash or to liberate the forces of production. Then others say, no, he just realized that, this state model under Mao failed and they wanted to more closely approximate the Western model. Of course, there's a bit of overlap between those two arguments, but where do you stand on where Deng was politically?
I think that he was, I think he remained Marxist, or he remained Leninist, let me put it like that. And that's why I actually think the current also regime in China and the current development can be very well understood if you think of China. And Deng said that being a new economic policy, it's Lenin's policy from 1920s, where you essentially unleash the private sector, but you never give up the political power. So in other words, you let them be rich, have a good life, but you keep an eye on them. And on top of that, the political power stays with you and you insulate the state from the rich people. And I think if I were to define it like that and to present it to Deng, I think he would agree.
There's that sort of there's a TED talk by Eric E. Lee, and you always see him popping up on social media, and he makes this argument, which you kind of formulate in the book as political capitalism, which is to say you have a market or a mixed market economy, but a market economy for profit, with wage labor, with a working class, with an economic elite. But the point is, capital, big C capital, doesn't set the political objectives of the ruling party, and therefore determine the national interest. And, Eric E. Lee says something quite similar. And I think it's a really good explanation of China. And I think we're going to learn a ton of lessons from China here in the West in regards to that over the coming years. You mentioned the new economic policy and really this idea that actually China, post-Deng, has a new economic policy that might last, a century, who knows?
Right.
Is that where the USSR started to get things wrong? Is there another alternative world where the NEP carries on and actually...
I actually think if you want really to sort of make the alternatives, one alternative was very, how should I say, likely alternative when it happened in 1921-22 is NEP or NEP continues. You don't have collectivization of agriculture. As we know, Ukrainian agriculture is extremely rich and Russian as well too. They could actually feed themselves very well, export as they continued exporting. The issue was, are we going to go for that type of agricultural development, which then can retard our industrialization? And I think that was the main dividing line between, as we know actually from the literature at the time, between people who wanted industrialization at every cost because that was the sign of a successful and powerful economy. And to some extent, they were also afraid again of being attacked. And if you have industry, obviously you're going to have the military and stuff like that. But I think that the path of agricultural development with free trade and sort of so-called netmen prospering would have been better for the Soviet Union. And there was a book by Bob Allen, the English-British historian, that actually looks at that kind of a counterfactual. And he thinks actually that counterfactual would have been better for the Soviet Union. I forget the name of the book, but it's actually a book about the Soviet Union, and it's actually studying precisely that point. Did collectivization actually improve industrialization? In other words, did your ability to extract so much surplus from the peasants, and on top of that to kill 3 million of them, did it really help industrialization in a significant way? And his argument is no.
What were the arguments, or what were the debates within the Politburo and the people around Lenin at the time? Because presumably you have a massive surplus from agricultural production, which you can sell, and you can reinvest the proceeds of that into industrialization, which was kind of the idea of the 5-year plans anyway.
But of course, they wanted to take it, really forcibly. And so they didn't want to let private enterprise or small private enterprise or peasants and so on really sell the goods on their own side, which was a mistake. Actually, going back to China, if you remember, actually, we mentioned that 1978 was liberalization in China. It was exactly like that. The communes were ended. De facto private ownership of land is still formally state. It's not individual, but de facto is individual. And individuals started paying taxes in kind. So in other words, you produce whatever you do, but okay, I'm going to give to the state 20%, but everything else is for my own either consumption or sales. And that was, I think, the model that NEP, New Economic Policy, promoted. And actually that model, I think, would have worked quite well in the Soviet Union.
I could go down a rabbit hole with you and talk about this for the next hour. I think some people watching and listening would love to see that conversation. But really, this book is about the world we're living in after 2008, 2016. You say that the era of neoliberal hegemony is ended or is coming to an end. We're living in its kind of embers, and that we are seeing the end of history. Unpack that a little.
Yes. First of all, the first point, I think that very few people would disagree that neoliberal globalization, or a globalized neoliberalism, whichever way you want to put it, that we have been used to since probably 1990, and which had probably its peak around 2000, 2002, when China joined WTO. I think that period has ended. And I think it is obvious that it has ended because the economic policies of the large countries, big countries like the United States or China, have changed. They have changed externally because they have become much more mercantilistic. In the case of the United States, not only since the last election of Trump, it was actually since 2016 and continued by Biden. So that international part has changed ideologically. Of course, trade is still going on, and trade to GDP ratio has not changed and all that. But ideologically, you don't have the same situation that you had 10 years ago, where it was believed, we don't really take into account politics. We have, supply chains, doesn't matter where it is, whoever is cheaper will use that guy. It has really changed now.
Sorry, can I ask, when you say ideologically, what does that mean? Because I suppose many people say, well, Trump says something, but actually, like you say, global trade to GDP is broadly unchanged.
Broadly unchanged, yeah.
You say ideology, they would say rhetoric. So what do you mean by ideology?
Well, what I mean by the ideology is that actually people nowadays think much more, and they act to some extent upon that, whether, for example, certain goods would be produced in China or would be produced in Vietnam or India, and whether it is better to actually buy them from India because it is safer in the case of conflict with China. It is kind of obvious that China, for example, had all the problems with IPOs in the United States. With TikTok, which we know, it's also obvious that we have now rare earth as a sort of a political issue. It's no longer an economic issue, buy it or sell it. So the economic things are now used as a political tools. In other words, there is a political coercion to do certain things which in the past would be done purely on economic grounds. So I think it's not only the rhetoric, it is just that things have changed and that there is an adjustment on both sides. In where you produce, what type of, as I was saying, supply chains you want to support, what you don't want to support. It is just a different world. And of course, on top of that, we have the war between Russia and Ukraine, which again has changed situation with Europe and Russia, exports of gas, which now don't exist anymore. So these are fundamental changes which are driven by politics and war.
Yes, Sergei Plokhy was saying that this is not a particularly outrageous claim, the big winner of the Russia-Ukraine war is China. And something you talk about in the book, which I've never really focused on before, is this idea that there's a long-term decoupling of Russia from Europe,
Yeah.
which is a geographical coupling. All the major Russian cities are near Europe because it's historically been a European power. And you kind of begin to talk about the possibility of, the center of Russian economic life shifting east. That's a really fascinating idea, isn't it?
It is a fascinating idea. It's kind of hard to happen, but there is a certain logic to it. As I said, it's very hard to imagine that you would have 10 million people from St. Petersburg and Moscow moving to Vladivostok tomorrow. It's very hard. But because Russia was centered into Europe. But if you take a longer term view and say, okay, this break between Russia and Europe is, we cannot say permanent because nothing is permanent, but it's a long term break. It is very unlikely that Europe would go back to what is perceived a state of dependency in terms of energy to Russia, because there will be precedents. They will say, look, there was a Cold War, then there was a hot war, there was stuff like that. So they would not go there. That would push Russia, it already is happening, to be much more directed towards trade and exchanges with the South, which means India and China. And then there is another argument. If you could actually just transport people costlessly, you say, why shouldn't I develop the Pacific where actually the center of economic activity is? So why shouldn't I be closer to China, which is now growing, and an Asian region, whereas Europe is not growing? So in some sense, it is reasonable to imagine that Russia would shift east. But as I said, it is very difficult to achieve. Now, let me just go make a counter argument against that. Think of St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg did not exist until Peter the Great decided to build it. It was marshes and nothing. So he decided to build it as a sort of open port towards Europe. So that was a political project as well. I'm not saying that actually it's as easy to go, I don't know, like 6,000 kilometers or whatever, east. But one can imagine a political project which would be, or sort of through economic exchanges, that you do have different distribution of population.
You put some numbers actually on just how, enormous Russia is. It's 16 million, I think, square kilometers. But to fly from one end to the other is like 9 hours.
9 hours.
Not a train, to fly. Yeah. It's just incredible. So, I think that's quite plausible.
It's much higher. That's another thing. When you think of the development of the American Pacific coast, it started also from nothing until 1849. But, of course, it's closer. You fly from New York to San Francisco 5 hours and a half. And I think Moscow to Vladivostok is like 9. Difference, yeah.
Let's stick with China. You, again, because there are just tons of numbers on this, and there's one particular graph which elucidates how badly Britain has done in the last 15 years. We'll talk about that more in a few minutes. But you seem to insinuate, if not explicitly say, that the rise of China, particularly since the 1980s, is more historically significant than the industrialization of Europe. Now, obviously, Europe catalyzes a global process, the Industrial Revolution, but in terms of just sheer stuff being made and people's lives being transformed, the two are incomparable. So this process, this moment we're living within, the transformation of China as it ascends to the top rank of global economic powers, how should we think of it, and where are we sitting in that sort of period? Are we still at the start? Are we in the middle? Are we at the end?
I think we should really realize, maybe actually contemporaries have trouble realizing that, but we should realize that we're really living in a period of dramatic global transformation, to use the title of the book, which is similar but bigger. It is similar to the Industrial Revolution in the following sense. The Industrial Revolution created what is called the Great Divergence. West European countries and then North America afterwards, and finally Japan, became much richer. Big countries like India and China stagnated or even declined in the case of China. It created huge gap in incomes between these countries and in welfare of the people, and actually enabled also colonization and the spread of the Western countries around the world. when you look at today's situation with the rise of India and China, Indonesia, and so forth, you clearly had a reversal of that. You can just look at the numbers. I mean, there were some graphs there that you mentioned. You simply have these countries going back to the position relative to the West, which they had in 1750 or 1800, when they were not as far behind. So there is a clear reversal. What was bigger now is that simply there are more people involved in that than they were in 1750 or 1800. So I would say, to summarize, I would say geopolitically, it is as dramatic fact as the Industrial Revolution. In terms of the numbers of people, simply because the world has now 8.4 billion people, it involves more people. But it is it was totally dramatic as the Industrial Revolution was. So I think it's undoing the effects of the Industrial Revolution at the level of individual incomes. It's actually bringing, if you will, the world back to the distribution of economic power in Eurasian continent to where it was in 1500, where China and India were not different from Italy, or not significantly different from Italy or England or the Netherlands.
I love Downstream so much. It's pretty much the most enlightening conversation I have every week. Except, of course, those with my wife and my daughter, my 2-year-old daughter. They're very sharp as well. But after that, it's always Downstream. And that's often something I hear from you guys as well. You love it. You love the events. You love the show. You want more. Well, there is more. There's a newsletter. It's brand new. The first one was published last week. We have another one out this week. Get on that train. Novara.media/Downstream newsletter. We are talking to some of the most interesting people in the world about some of the biggest issues. We can't cram it all in. The video. And there's also some nice little anecdotes and vignettes that you'll find exclusively in that newsletter. If you want to get smarter, if you want to have a smile on your face before the new working week begins, subscribe to the newsletter. Do yourself a favor. Have you read Exterminate the Brutes? I'm sure you have, by Sven Lindqvist.
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
And he talks about, again, for people who aren't really big into political economy, and the relationship between technological change and politics and military power, the ability to project it. He talks about, you obviously don't get steamships without steam, and you don't get Gatling guns without that stuff. And all of a sudden, over the space of 70 years, British soldiers can just go up these rivers within the interior of Africa and just mow down thousands of people at a time with weapons. And for somebody in your game, that's just an obvious connection. But I think often we fail to understand how much of a game changer the Industrial Revolution was not just for us, but for the entire planet. So where are we in that moment for China? It starts, let's say, with Deng. Where are we with that now?
I think we are not. I mean, if you take that example, we are not there yet, or maybe we'll never get there, because to some extent, China is recapturing the position that it had before. Like we're talking about, I said, 1500. It does not necessarily imply, nor it may not be even feasible, for the Chinese to do the same thing that, for example, the British did to China. Because when you mentioned that, of course, the British went with their ships into the inland waters of China, and they went all the way to the Spring Palace, and of course opened the ports and all of that. I don't see this happening now. I don't see China in the next 20 years or 30 or 50 years telling the Brits actually that they should import French cognac like the Brits asked them to import opium. I don't see that. So that kind of maybe raw military power may not be exercised because the other side is also very strong. But some other power may be exercised. Maybe China would exercise it in Africa. Maybe it would exercise it in weaker European countries, or actually South Asia. We don't know that. So, but it is not unreasonable to assume that with a huge economic success and industrialization, and actually nowadays new technologies, you also develop the means of coercion that you might want to use. But it's a guess, obviously.
Well, so much of it's a guess.
Yeah.
You talk about China's rise in relation to the United States, and I want, from a big brain who was at the World Bank, I want to know which is the measure to use. Because, of course, if people look at nominal GDP, America is still much bigger than China. In terms of PPP, a different measure for GDP, China is now significantly bigger than the US. So which one should people trust?
Well, I think you can use both. I mean, let me tell you why I have preference for the PPP measure. First of all, because I work with income distribution, income inequality, and you use PPP because you want to say, okay, what is the welfare of people? So if I have this coffee and I have this water, it should be counted in terms of price the same everywhere. So it is true that in London, this is much more expensive than, let's suppose, in Calcutta. But when I talk about the welfare, the guy who is in Calcutta and he drinks this coffee and drinks this water should actually get the same utility, if you will, as I do. So in that sense, I'm in favor of PPP. PPP simply means China produces like now like 15, well, 20, 30% more of stuff than the US. But when you go to the exchange rates, you say, okay, they produce all of this stuff, but let's suppose they sell all this stuff at the rate, at the prices that they have now. They would get less than the US. So it is true that actually, at some level, exchange rate PPP, exchange rate GDP makes sense. So I'm for using both, but I really see the advantages of the PPP rather than the at market exchange rates. Plus of that, you can take the following thing. If China were to to actually appreciate yuan, it would eliminate half of the gap. The current gap is about 30% in favor of the US. Let's suppose that China appreciates by 10%. Half of the gap will be gone. So it is, nothing has happened. It's simply that there was a change in the exchange rate and then half of the gap is gone.
So for people watching, basically, China could muck about this economy, and by nominal GDP, it could be the largest economy in the world, but that doesn't advantage its exporters, actually it disadvantages
Exactly. It would make actually Chinese export more expensive, Chinese growth rate lower. Yeah. So you can become bigger, but then you pay the cost in terms of the exports and the growth of the economy. China, actually, when you read Chinese papers and stuff in English, I unfortunately cannot read Chinese, but they very often insist on second largest economy. They never mention the largest economy. It's insistent and it's not accidental. It's always the second largest.
Is that from the whole, hide your strength, bide your time kind of?
It looks like that because they could actually say the largest economy. Yeah.
It's the polar opposite of British politics where, our politicians still say everything's world leading and we're still, world number one in terms of aviation engines. They clutch at straws where we're still number one. The Chinese are saying, no, we're number two. We're not,
Maybe there is something to that. That's what Deng said. Of course, most people like to be number one. I'm sure they like to. But I've noticed that in the China Daily, for example, which is de facto official publication, and elsewhere, even in the political documents, there is always this mention of the second largest in a positive way. Like we are strong, we are big, but we're second.
Often when we talk about Russia and Ukraine, you get. And this really winds me up, analysts on X, and they'll say, how on earth are we taking Russia seriously? Their GDP is the size of Italy's. And then, of course, you look at PPP, which is the measure you're talking about. It's the fourth largest economy in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, when we're looking at Russia and its military-industrial complex, surely we should be looking at PPP, not nominal GDP.
No, I agree totally. And I think Russia is, in terms of PPP, actually, I don't know, fifth or sixth, actually. It's a large economy, so it's not actually true to say it is the same as Italy.
Yeah. Well, I think it overtook Japan recently on like CIA fact book or something. So, because you look at the nominal GDP, US is number one, Russia's barely in the top 10, not even in the top 10, I think. And then you look at PPP, China's number one and Russia's, above the likes of the UK and France. And it's a whole different geopolitical reality.
True.
And I do get really worried when I look at, or I see rather, sort of powerful people in this country looking at the nominal GDP.
But you in the first chapter of my book, actually, which is called The Rise of Asia, you have, I think, this kind of cool graphs where actually I show what were kind of the challenges of the West. When the new international economic order happened in 74-75, if you look at the distribution by different political parts of the world, the West was 50% of global GDP or thereby, and of course lots of population. China was only 2% of global GDP, 20% of the population. So when you look at this number, you say, well, it is not a power in economic terms, but it could become a power simply because there are so many people. When you look at Russia today, which is also solitary in the same way that China was solitary then because it was not part of some kind of a association or group, Russia produces 3% of GDP, global GDP, but it has only 2% of population. So it is clearly not in the same league that China was in 1974. And it is, I think, some kind of a difference there. And China nowadays is like 10 times as big as Russia in terms of both population and GDP.
And I think you have in the book that at its peak, the USSR comprised about 12% of global GDP.
Right.
Which is just, it's incomparable to the rise of China now.
Incomparable. It's like 22 versus 12, actually. And the USSR was, for a long time, the second largest economy. These are the World Bank data, which are done retroactively. And then it was overtaken by Japan. Then Japan was overtaken by China. And then eventually China overtook the United States. But it is interesting also that the China and US now represent almost 40% of global GDP. This is a lot, like for two countries, really, to have like almost, 40% of global GDP is a lot.
That's proper bipolarity, right?
Yeah, it's kind of a bipolarity, exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Is social mobility dead in the West today?
No.
Is it dying?
I think it's lower than it used to be. And that's actually what I was discussing in part in chapter 3 about the elites in the West. The elites in the West are what I call homoplutic, which means that they are at the same time among the richest capitalists and the richest wage earners. And on top of that, of course, they are people with credentials and so-called quote-unquote meritocratic view of the world. And in such a world, obviously, your kids, if they come from such family with all these advantages, are very likely to succeed, and social mobility will be less. So it is factually true that social mobility, if you look at the US, since 1980s, has declined, and actually it is consistent decline. So you have consistent increase in inequality, consistent decline in social mobility. But it doesn't mean that social mobility has stopped.
Well, I suppose it's still alive, but it's mostly downwards. I mean, if we're talking about real social mobility, the proletarianization of the middle class is the real story.
That could be, yeah, it could be. But yeah, I was actually thinking of the sort of numbers that look at social mobility, regardless whether it is up or down. It simply measure the change in the position of the children compared to the parents.
Yeah.
So that could be both of them, But it's also true, if there is social mobility down, social mobility is an ordinal number. So if somebody goes from the 60th percentile to the 45th, which is downward mobility, well, somebody has to fill the 60th percentile. So somebody has to come there as well.
Yeah.
So I'm not quite sure one can say definitely that social mobility has declined, but I would not go too far to say that we don't have it anymore.
Yeah. I mean, you have this great chart where you talk about earners. So it includes, as I understand it, capital gains from assets as well as incomes. The top 5% of earners globally, and of course, the United States is runaway number one.
Right.
The UK was number 2 in 2008. It's really fallen, which I find fascinating. And then, of course, China has done really well. Most of I think all the European countries have actually fallen a little bit.
Right.
And that to me was a really interesting story, and it kind of visualized the extent of Britain's problems in recent years. There was a great podcast recently with Eliza Philby, who is a professor over here. And she said, the meme on social media is, I need to marry a guy in finance. What they're actually doing is they're marrying somebody whose dad was in finance.
True.
That's the reality rather than like the TikTok meme, even if it sounds less sexy. Is that a threat to our political model?
I think actually what is a threat to the political model is just what I said before, and actually what you also said is the rise of this, what I call the homoplutic elite. Homoplutic simply means, I invented this term because the term didn't, you had to make up some Greek word, Homoplutic means technically same wealth. What I meant by that is that there is a rise of people who are at the same time having very large capital incomes from property and very large, high incomes from labor. This is an unprecedented situation. Think of the 19th century Britain, or even early 20th century and mid 20th century. You had the top guys, and the top guys generally had income from capital. I'm not saying they didn't have any income from labor, but what this homoplutic means is not only that you are in the top decile by capital income, which means you're really a rich capitalist. You're in the top decile by labor income, which means that you really work hard, you're very high level, and you are paid for your labor. And this is what I believe is a new elite. And that elite, of course, transmits all these advantages to their kids. And that's what's actually what your interlocutor, I think, also meant. And what I find worrisome is that elite, because it is meritocratic, quote unquote, elite, believes that they totally deserve that position, and they are hardworking elite. We have actually the data that show that people with higher wage per hour tend to work many more hours. So combine all of that, that I am rich capitalist, I am rich worker, I work very much, I feel that I deserve this position, I feel that I should give all these advantages to my children. The children actually go to best schools, they get high incomes themselves and inherit high incomes. So you really have an elite which is very hard to sort of break.
When does that change, by the way, amongst the elite? This idea that the wealthiest, most high-performing, or most economically, culturally successful people, politically successful people, are the ones that work hardest. So, you'll be following some billionaire on Instagram, and he'll be sharing a picture of his alarm clock getting up at 5 a.m. Yeah. But the point was, for almost all of human history, was to amass wealth in order to join the leisure class. When does that shift happen?
I don't know. It's really an excellent question, but I think that shift happened probably over the last 50 years or so. But there was certainly a cultural shift. There was a cultural shift that you accept for some small groups, but you believe, first, you tend to underplay your wealth. Many of them don't want to accept that they're wealthy. And secondly, you want to create the impression that wealth is the result of your intelligence and hard work. And Daniel Markovits, whom I quote in the book, says, such a new elite has the old-fashioned virtues. And the old-fashioned virtue, and dislikes. The old-fashioned virtues is actually hard work, almost Calvinist type, stuff, although they consume a lot, but they hide that. But part of that is also contempt from those who did not succeed. Because if you believe that the entire success is based on measurable criteria like intelligence, hard work, or abstinence, or whatever you want to call it, and those who don't have it then consequently have either to be lazy or not to be, smart, or to be too driven by passions or whatever. So you create that moral judgment, which, in my opinion, was driving quite a lot of dissatisfaction with either Hillary or with people who oppose Trump.
So this idea that the highest of high when it comes to income are also increasingly the highest of high when it comes to capital gains, people who are doing really well from not working. I wonder, that's clearly a global phenomenon, but is that more of a phenomenon in the United States, where you have obviously big tech and people are joining companies when they're small and they're getting equity and stocks in the company rather than being paid? Because I look at the UK, we have a different economic model. We're a sub-imperial state. Or I look at France, which has a much larger state, and the public servants still paid pretty well. It doesn't have a new economy like the US. Are you describing, in terms of elite and these new characteristics of it, is that more prevalent in the US, or is it just leading and will eventually follow?
I think it's leading. Actually, I think I have a graph there. The US, if you take the 10% of the richest people in the US and the UK and France and Mexico, let's say, what you find is that 1/3 of that 10%, which means like 3% plus, in the US are this homoplutic elite. In West European countries, that percentage is 20% of that elite. So we are talking about 2% of the population in the UK. So it's less. But if you look at old-fashioned capitalist countries like Mexico and Brazil, very few people are that elite, because people who are rich capitalists, they are not really lawyers. or they are not software developers. So I think it is something that the US is in many cases leading, but it's not something that is unknown elsewhere. And I think it will become the same.
And so somebody like Gary Stevenson, who's become this big voice in this country when it comes to inequality, Gary Stevenson would say, you've had this massive divergence in incomes. The wealthiest of the wealthy now have so much money, they have a lower marginal propensity to spend.
Mm-hmm.
What do they do with it? They buy assets which will generate returns for them. Is that what's driving this?
Well, this is a theory. It is actually interesting that you mentioned that, because this is the issue which was raised even during the Great Recession. It's kind of simple, but it may be true. It's essentially, you have high inequality. That means that there are quite a few people who are wealthy, and they have excess savings simply because the marginal propensity to consume is low. You don't know what to do with that. So they are in search of alternative ways to invest that money. And that was the story, of course, before World War I as well, is essentially you search for that. There was a paper, and there were like some studies by two guys, I think Sufi and Amin, arguing that the subprime crisis was the result of that. Essentially, you had to offer to them something. You didn't know what to offer. So either you invest in China or elsewhere, or you invest in something which turned out to be extremely risky, and that was camouflaged by not being risky. But it is important there to realize that, and I think people did realize, not maybe immediately after the crisis, is that inequality was generating what became the bubble. And it was doing that because simply the people on the top had surplus money, and they have to do something with that money.
But that is a really, if you try and explain that to people in this country, if you make the argument, for instance, for a wealth tax, not just to fund better public services or to reduce the deficit, but to change this pattern. I mean, that's actually what Gary says. It's not just to fund the state, but we need to stop this recursive feedback loop of the ultra-rich buying more assets, exacerbating rentierism, and going over and over and over again. Do you think the political class, the Western political class, understand the nature of that feedback loop? Or
I think they understand, but they probably don't want to do that because like we saw the French tax that failed now, that the idea to actually to tax people with high wealth. I don't know. They may be afraid that actually these high wealth people would leave the country, or they would invest money elsewhere, that the money would not stay. I don't know. But I think the logic seems to me rather clear, and it is an old logic. We're going even to, actually, it was a British economist, John Hobson, who originally defined it. It was underconsumptionist. And many economists didn't like this idea of underconsumptionist. But it is true that, that was, after all, Keynes who used it, that the marginal propensity to consume decreases with income. So at some point, when you have huge income and you have huge wealth, you cannot all consume it, and people don't consume it. And that's the issue.
So when Liz Truss was giving tax cuts to the ultra-rich, that was just, in terms of trying to help with final demand, that was just the stupidest thing you can do.
Well, it seems to me it's actually, that going back to the elementary Keynesianism, if you want to increase aggregate demand, you do have to redistribute from rich people to poor people, not because you necessarily like poor people, but because they are going to spend that money, and the rich people will not spend that money. So there will not be the multiplier effect. And it's actually interesting that Keynes, but that's another topic, Keynes did not use that particular sort of way to increase aggregate demand. He mentioned that, of course, MPC is playing a prominent role there, but he preferred actually to go with the state spending directly rather through redistribution. And I think it was a political decision, but maybe that's a different topic.
Well, he's living through First World War, Great Depression. He's the front line to all of that stuff, so it kind of adds up, right?
It adds up, but it actually raises the question, why wouldn't he actually put the onus or put the emphasis, rather, on redistribution rather than government spending? Because you can achieve the same objective by taking money from rich, giving to the poor, you increase aggregate demand. Or you can achieve the same objective by increasing government spending. So in my opinion, he decided to go for the second alternative. Now, that's more for people who study Keynesianism. I will stop there. But I think there was clearly an alternative which implied redistribution.
So should we be taxing wealth more and work less?
I think we should be definitely taxing wealth more. Work less, well, that's a big question. If you again look at the objectives that many economists had, uh, they thought what is the ultimate objective of wealth? Is actually to have a nice life where you do whatever you want, which doesn't mean that you don't necessarily work, because many people like to work, but you don't work simply because you need money. I mean, imagine a society of full abundance, then you could still work because, I mean, maybe you like to write or to interview. Another guy who likes to go and, I don't know, fish and then sell fish. But this would not be the same type of work that we do now, where people who work at, I don't think to work at warehouses in Amazon. I don't think that they are like enjoying it.
Because this is a debate now we're having in this country. We've got our budget at the end of November. And, lots of people, like in France, like with Mamdani, we'll talk about him in a minute, in the US, talking about a wealth tax. And I think a wealth tax, I'm on the left, I'm a socialist, but a wealth tax is necessarily coded as a left-wing thing. And I don't really understand why more people on the populist right, and I don't mean MAGA, I mean, more in Europe, really, these sort of the political representation of the petit bourgeois, why there aren't more people who advance the interests of small business saying we need to tax wealth so that the dude on Main Street has more money to go into your shop, you're
True.
owned by your family, and actually that's going to help you. And it seems really strange to me that nobody in the centre-right seems to understand this argument. Nobody. They're still very much addicted to, corporate plutocracy, Thatcherism, Reaganism, and it's very strange that they don't entertain these arguments.
But it seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong on that, but it seems to me that many of such people are afraid of two things. First of all, they are not sure to whom that tax would apply, and they may be afraid, somehow maybe it will come to me. Although I'm not rich, but maybe it will just go down and I will have to pay it. And secondly, the argument which I've heard very often, I think in Germany in particular, and Austria, and I think even in Italy, is that people are afraid that it would actually cover small businesses that are being sort of inherited from one generation to another. I do believe that there must be, I don't know, but there must be ways to formulate that. And, recently there was a referendum, for example, in Switzerland, that there was a tax rate of 50% on wealth above 50 million euro. Well, this is a pretty high wealth, and probably it would not include small businesses. It would probably, I'm not sure actually, but it might include only the wealth that you have, financial wealth that you have. That doesn't seem to me would affect too many people. So that seems reasonable. On the other hand, the counter argument that people say, well, if it doesn't affect too many people, then the intake of the tax would be small. So what will you achieve?
So in this country last year, I'm sure you know this, we had the increase to employers' national insurance contributions. Now, I kind of buy the argument. For the most part, that just means that the following year, the employer gives a lower pay rise to staff and they probably bump their prices up a little bit. And they do that rather than increasing capital gains tax. So right now, for somebody in the higher threshold taxpayer, even for them, the capital gains, we have two rates of capital gains tax in this country, is still lower than what they pay on incomes. And bizarrely, and maybe you can explain this to me, we tax dividends and capital gains at different rates. So dividends is higher than capital gains. And I don't understand why Rachel Reeves, the Labour Party, don't just standardise dividends tax, capital gains, and incomes tax.
I don't know either, but I know in the US too, actually, the capital gains are really taxed at lower rate. I think that the idea that I have is that capital gains would be reinvested and actually they would be used to employ people. And I think this is the only rationale, because you may want to tax capital incomes lower because you believe that capital incomes would then be used to actually employ more people and to do more business.
That was always the argument for having a higher rate of corporation tax, because again, for people on the right, they say, oh, it's about getting money. No, it's also about creating incentives to maximize reinvestment in productive capacity, because you don't want to pay it in tax. Anyway.
No, but the ultimate sort of extreme solution would be to have a zero tax. Because if you were to assume that all capital incomes would be reinvested, you could have a zero tax. The problem with that is that over time, you would actually create an incredibly rich minority who would be keeping reinvesting. So the end result of that, you will be an unsustainable inequality.
Mm-hmm. Infinite buy-to-lets. And
infinite. That would be infinite. That would be an infinite genie, and it would be an infinite, actually, situation where you would have a huge polarization and a huge concentration of capital.
In the book, you talk about, going back to geopolitics, you move away from this idea of the global north or the first world, and you talk about the political West.
Yeah.
And the only person I've really heard talk about the political West is Sergei Lavrov. And I'm not suggesting.
Oh, did he use that word? Okay.
Well, I often hear it from I hear the formulation often from the Russians. I mean, I agree with it. It makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah, it does. Yeah,
but it just explain to me what you mean by the political West. Who are the political West?
I was, impressed by a book you mentioned, Sub-Imperial Power, but it was a book by Fernandez about Australia as a sub-imperial power. Australia is not a member of NATO, okay? So, but it clearly works the same. And actually, with the tensions in China, it became very clear that what it was a Quad, what was formed, that you have Korea, the Philippines, Indonesia, and New Zealand, that were part of the political West. And if you ask me, okay, what is the political West? Just go to the Heathrow Airport. Who are the people who actually go through the electronic passport controls? It's the political West. So what you go, and it is EU, of course, UK, obviously, EU, and plus Norway and Switzerland. Then US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, and I think that was all. So I would call the political West the countries that enter UK through electronic passport control.
And is that effectively US empire? How should we understand it?
I think it's de facto US empire. You had actually other people who had given points in time. For example, Colombia at one point wanted to join NATO, but now the government has changed. But of course, Milei also wanted to join NATO. So I do think that the term political West has a sense because it's no longer the West alone. I mean, you can call Japan the West as it was called a long time ago. But if you now have more countries in the Pacific region that they are aligned themselves with the US and the West, I think we have to find a new term for that. And that's why I use the political West.
And you talk in relation to China being the new USSR, and you say, look, it was very, very hard to integrate Russia into that configuration of effectively US states, vassal states, sub-imperial states, etc. Even harder to do that with China. Somewhere like India, where does that fit in? Because even if it's politically amenable, it's obviously 1.45 billion people. Yeah. Is that part of the political West, or could they be part?
No, India is not part of political West. I don't think that we can actually consider India as part of political West. India, of course, has its own policy. It's not particularly friendly to China. But India is not part of the political West simply because it doesn't follow, and I think that was very clear even under Biden. India follows its own interests and does not, does not play the role that was, I think, very nicely described by Fernandez of the sub-imperial power. Sub-imperial power has certain role over this area, but this role is essentially given to it by the imperial power. So the imperial power doesn't have the means to control everything, so it actually delegates one part of that role to a sub-imperial power. I don't see that we can say that the US delegates anything to India or that India accepts. India does certain things which it finds its own interest, but I think it does it because it finds it, it likes to do it, but not because the US does it.
I really like that idea of the sub-imperial power, because I think of the UK now as a vassal state, particularly with regards to big tech, and its dependence on US infrastructure. Even our security services use Amazon Web Services, But I like this idea that economically we're vassal states, but in the sphere of geopolitics and military affairs, we're something different. And that then all of a sudden it makes sense that, J.D. Vance would say to the Europeans, you should be paying more on defense spending, because on the one hand you think, well, these are vassal states. You want them to be vassal states. You don't want them to be a strident presence in global affairs with powerful militaries. But on the other hand, actually, no, you want to socialize the costs of these,
True.
these subordinate powers that do your... Is that how we should understand it?
I see
economic
it definitely
vassalage,
like
and
that.
then...
But I would not use the word vassal because it is sort of pejorative. But sub-imperial, I think it actually defines the relationship. And if you look, and actually they have a section on that on China, why China can never, in my opinion, become integrated in that system simply because it's too big. The imperial structure is a hierarchical structure. You have somebody at the top, and then you have big powers like the UK, France, Japan, Germany that are in the second range or second realm. And then you go further down and you have actually very small countries that are part of that system. And I think actually that system is quite good for small countries because it, especially in the past, led them not to invest too much in the military and enjoy the protection. So I think for the small countries, that system is very good. The problem of that system, it cannot incorporate a big country like China, because then the question becomes, who is the hegemon? So China is not going to play a role of sub-imperial power.
Yeah.
And that's the problem.
US empire has definitely been very good for Ireland, Malta, Iceland.
Yeah.
They've never had it better.
No, even countries like the Netherlands, for example.
Yeah.
Now, it is very good, actually, because you have many advantages. These, public goods are basically provided by the US. You don't have to worry about that. You know that nobody will dare to attack you. You just concentrate on what you're doing, and you are small enough. You don't expect to have a big role internationally. And the role that you have some role at the World Bank. You go and give talks and all of that. And you have some role also in aid of the poor countries. It makes you feel good. It's a phenomenal arrangement for the small countries.
Yeah. You just focus on your Stroopwaffeln and your coffee and
you have great time.
Yeah, the B-52s flying over.
Yeah, and it's like you say, well, that's excellent. But, with larger countries, bigger countries, and historically more important countries, it becomes more difficult. I was recently reading Raymond Aron's memoirs from the 1940s all the way to the 1980s. And he describes difficulties, especially that de Gaulle and the French had with the US. The difficulties, it's actually interesting in his book, is that they are part of that political West, but they are a large country, and historically they have been an important country. So their relationship with the US was always difficult and fraught, because they would not just accept what the US tells them without sort of, questioning that. So it was a difficult relationship. And as you know, de Gaulle actually got out of the military part of NATO command, and then France got back later. But it is a more difficult relationship than for a small country.
There's a great quote from Khomeini when he's asked, what's the main achievement of the Islamic Revolution? Mm-hmm. And of course, if you looked at people on X, they would say it's hijab or whatever. Obviously, he says the major accomplishment is that Iran, for the first time in centuries, is ruled from Tehran. It's sovereignty. It's a sovereigntist argument. And I think this is an argument for these middle powers that aren't in the political West. I think people don't realize how significant that idea is. And of course, some people would portray that as anti-imperialist. I think that's probably accurate. Are we moving to a more multipolar world? And is that a good or bad thing?
Well, the subtitle actually says National Market Liberalism in a Multipolar World. So national market liberalism is my sort of renaming of the system that would replace, or it is in the process of replacing, neoliberal globalization. And to make it very simple, it is a system where neoliberalism remains domestically dominant and maybe gets even deeper, but eliminates all the international part, like, for example, part which has to do with low tariffs, free flow of labor, capital, and so on. But go back to the multipolar world, yes, I think we are actually entering a multipolar world, especially because of China, because it is, you can say it's bipolarity between the US and China, but it's more complicated than that, because powers of the they're way above the mid-sized powers like India, do start now to play an autonomous role. Russia is playing an autonomous role. It's clearly Russia's policies are totally autonomous. They can, I'm not saying they can do whatever they want, but they are not being controlled by anybody. And I think other countries like South Africa, Brazil, are actually becoming much more assertive and vocal than they used to be. And in that sense, I do think that we are entering a multipolar world.
And is that good or bad? From a European perspective, is that a good or bad thing?
For the European perspective, it probably is bad, because I think it actually downgrades Europe to the position of the middle power, and makes, of course, other countries like India, which has 1.4 billion people, more important. So I would not say it's a very good thing for
So in a
Europe.
multipolar world, India is more important than the European Union.
Well, European Union is 500 million. Of course, it's much richer, but it grows more slowly than India. I'm not saying that it's currently, obviously, the European Union is very important economically,
Sure.
and then also intellectually. It is really, the ideas are still really mostly generated by the West. The reason why I'm actually writing this book in English is because of the ideas travel. But of course, India is actually, in terms of language, it's English speaking. But I do think that if you look at the sort of project the evolution, yes, the large countries that are growing fast and they are actually getting the new technology quite well will play more and more of a role, and in that sense, the world will become multipolar. And as I mentioned, it's not only India, China, Russia, the United States, Europe. It's also countries like South Africa and Brazil that I think are now really emerging. For me, what was an interesting move that when South Africa went for the International Criminal Court in The Hague, that was, I thought, interesting because it requires quite a lot of, how should I say, ability to politically do that, and they have done it. And no other, I mean, that seems that actually you have an infrastructure that is sufficiently powerful, and then you know how to hire, who lawyers, where to go, and not small countries wouldn't know how to do that.
Yeah, I think. I mean, other examples for me, Indonesia.
Oh, that's yes,
enormous
right.
economy, huge population. I think the world's most populous Muslim country, is a huge one, the size of Pakistan, if they ever get their act together, or somewhere like Taiwan, 30 million people. You've got, a $1 trillion plus company with TSMC. And I think, again, the sort of, in this country, I know you're based in New York, but in this country, just the level of political debate about what's going on in these, Vietnam, this exporting superpower now, nobody in Britain's talking about what Vietnam gets right. Nobody in Europe's talking about what Vietnam gets right, broadly speaking. And I think that just really signifies how kind of screwed we are in this new world we're moving into.
I'm actually very happy that you mentioned Indonesia, because I forgot to mention Indonesia. But Indonesia is really one of these. It's a huge country in terms of population. I think 240 million, and a country which is growing. And as somebody mentioned to me, I had this slide graph which shows the position of India, China, and Indonesia compared to their position during the Industrial Revolution. And you have a U-shaped curve. So they actually declined very much if you compare them to Britain. They declined very much down to 1970s, 1980s. And since then, they have what a friend of mine called remontada. And actually, I had Indonesia in a graph, but I actually focused on India and China. But Indonesia, too, had really a remarkable remontada. Even Turkey actually had a remontada compared to its position. Yeah.
Well, Turkey now, I know Turkey's got more people than the UK, but you look at its economy PPP, it's catching up with the UK. But again, nobody in Britain says that.
No, people actually forget. They don't look at things. Actually, it is also a fact that Turkey is now, in terms of GDP per capita, for the first time probably in, I don't know in how many centuries, caught with Greece. So it's a big change if you look at 1910 Greece or 1950, Greece was always much richer than Turkey. Turkey now has a GDP per capita which is close. I think the difference is like $1,000 or something.
One of the more fun bits of the book was where you look at theories of capitalist development, imperialism, and conflict. You have John Hobson in there. You have
Rosa Luxemburg,
yeah,
Lenin.
yeah, and Schumpeter as well, which I
Yeah,
find really
Schumpeter
interesting.
is super interesting.
So this relationship between monopoly
Right.
capital
Yeah.
and imperialism, just explain that to me. What is the connection between capitalism and imperialism?
Should I go through Schumpeter? Because he's
Please.
super interesting.
Super interesting.
And very few people know. Schumpeter wrote an enormous book, I think 1915 or thereabouts, about, it's called Sociology of Imperialisms, plural. And then more or less the argument, not fully, but then more or less the argument was, look, imperialism is really an old-fashioned idea. It is an idea which is really alien to real capitalist societies, because what capitalists want, they want trade, they want money, they want to sell you something, buy something from you. They're not interested in controlling your territory because they will be able to do that anyway through trade. So he says, why we have still that in capitalist countries is because there's a remnants, remains of all the aristocratic sort of desire to control people and territories is actually sort of anachronistic. That's what he said. But, and then actually he said very interesting sentence. He says, the least imperialistic countries are the most capitalist countries, UK and the USA. So then later he develops, and I think to some extent unaware, he develops in Capitalism, Socialism, and Democracy a view of the world where the monopolistic and large companies, oligopoly monopolistic companies, are very efficient. They're more efficient than small companies because they use economies of scale. But in their way of dealing with the economic world, they actually use all kinds of means: coercion, conquest, underselling, collusion, everything. But that makes them more efficient. But then he forgot, I think, that he said the only part of capitalists that are really sort of imperialistic are the precisely monopoly capitalism. So when you put Schumpeter, the whole work of Schumpeter, and you say, okay, he accepts that monopoly capitalism uses imperialistic methods to conquer markets. And he says that monopoly capitalism will become dominant capitalism because they are more efficient than small-scale capitalism. Ergo, what is the conclusion? Monopoly capitalism is a normal type of capitalism, and that normal type of capitalism is imperialistic. So I actually think that when you put Schumpeter all together, you basically have this sort of imperialist competition theory, which is very similar to Hobson, Rosa Luxemburg, and Lenin. So that was my argument.
Yeah, I love it. It's a very original argument. And just to go over Hobson, Lenin, and Luxemburg, this idea that you have high inequality within a capitalist society, which leads to underconsumption. Therefore, you have high incentives for the capitalist elites to go elsewhere to find cheap labor, cheap resources, and to get new markets. And of course, these capitalist states are in conflict with one another to access all of these things, and that is the explanation for the First World War.
That's what actually Schumpeter says too. He says, you have the waves of capital coming from each individual country. And actually Polanyi says also as well, waves of capital, and they go there. And they need government protection because they are not sure that the money would be repaid, that people would observe the contracts and all that. But he says that one wave for country X meets exactly the same wave for country Y. So immediately that gets conveyed back to the capitalists and you have the conflict. And that was the same in Polanyi. He actually has, I quoted, I think, in the book, he says precisely that sentence is actually trade follows the flag and then different flags basically fight it out.
Mm. And you make a really great point in the book, which is, look, people watching or listening might disagree with that. But what's really critical is that neoclassical economics has no account for why something like the First World War happens.
No.
It's just bad people do stupid things.
No.
And the Hobson, Lenin, Luxemburg theory and Schumpeter and Polanyi makes much more sense.
For me, it is absolutely striking that economics, which is accused generally, rightly, of being intellectually imperialist. In other words, economics explains everything: how many kids you have, what you like to eat, whether you exercise, like everything, like your preferences. It explains everything. So because it has this imperialistic tendency to go into sociology, to go into any social science. And there is this incredibly important event which takes place, the World War I, which takes place in the midst of the largest globalization that has ever existed in history up to that moment, and which has not been recaptured until about year 2000. So this event happens. So why wouldn't you have economistic theory why this event has happened? But no, there is no theory. It just happens. Okay, well, there is a guy who assassinated another guy in Sarajevo. That's the theory. Well, that's ridiculous. And the reason why they don't have a theory, because the only reasonable theory is precisely the one that we just mentioned. It's very hard to explain why in the peak of globalization you would have the countries that were clearly politically opposed to each other, where we believed that with globalization and mutual trade, the interests would be so strong, as was actually Norman Angel's argument, that the interests would be so strong that we would never go to war. Because we know that the war would be really bad for me and you. And it actually did happen. It was bad for me and you. And we knew that, and we still went to war.
It was Europe committing suicide, effectively.
It was a suicide. And actually, they all knew that this would happen. Of course, they were like sort of telling people we will be back by Christmas, but that was like nonsense. They knew that would be a disastrous event, and it still happens. So you have to have a theory why, an explanation why it happened. If your only explanation is that there are like accidental events left and right, this is not sufficient, because any accidental event has to be built upon something real so that the big powers go and fight it out.
You said Norman Angel, but obviously that's also there in Adam Smith and David Ricardo, this idea that the more trade, the greater as a leftist, you say the greater the development of the forces of production would mean a less violent world, not a more violent world.
No, it is true. But I would say with Adam Smith, I have this, how should I say? I think Adam Smith was much more nuanced writer. And there is a beautiful paragraph that I think I quote, where Adam Smith says the following. And I will paraphrase it because he says it's much better than I. But he says, yes, trade would actually, what trade will do, it would, I'm paraphrasing, it would develop to an equal measure all the trading nations. And the trading nations then would essentially have same technological development and same power. And they would be afraid of each other militarily. And that's what would keep the peace. So he has in that paragraph a view about trade being good for convergence, but he has a theory of balance of power. Because he says it is the mutual, I think there is a quote there is a mutual fear which would keep peace.
Yeah, he says inspiring mutual fear. So he's talking about trade developing the means of production, and that then leading to this kind of parity of military forces, which is kind of, you're not just insinuating this, you're saying this. The idea, Adam Smith, we like to think that Marx is smart or Isaac Newton is smart. This guy was basically talking about mutually assured destruction in the 1770s or whatever it was. Yeah.
Look, he was very nuanced. He was very smart. And actually, you can take this paragraph and apply it to the US-China. You say, okay, what has happened? China has become technologically very sophisticated. It is actually leading in many areas. And it militarily is kind of matching the US. So you say, it's the balance of power would keep peace. Okay. I think actually it's quite reasonable to believe that both sides would be afraid of each other, as Adam Smith says, and that would keep peace. Because he's very critical on European, in that same paragraph, he says that the fact that Europeans developed so much ahead, faster than the others, allowed them to, as he says, to commit multiple injustices against other people because they were simply superior in terms of military force. And then superiority of military force came from much greater technological development.
Yeah, he says the impunity, every sort of injustice in these remote countries.
Yes.
This is what's frustrating about Adam Smith. He's a very smart man. He says some things which we would consider socially progressive.
Yeah.
and yet he's been just co-opted by some of the worst people around.
Oh, but we should have talked about my visions of inequality, because many of the things come from the visions of inequality was study of how inequality was seen and studied by Smith, Ricardo, Marx, all the way to Kuznets. And I think actually Smith, and when you read Wealth of Nations, I think Smith is totally hijacked, because Smith is very critical about all organizations, including church. He's critical of government, but he's as much or more critical of associations of employers. He doesn't call them capitalists, of employers or masters, because they say they never, as you know, famous quote, they never meet together except to plot against the public interest. They should never be allowed to rule the government. There are people who actually get money through plunder. So he is very negative on that. But that part of Adam Smith has been taken out by Chicago, and they just focus on his critiques, right critiques of the government. So I think it has been, honestly, I think there has been a hijacking of Adam Smith.
Yeah, you can draw a straight line between what he's saying about cartels of employers and how they, shaft workers. You can draw a straight line between that and then the points you're talking about with regards to China and political authority, and the idea that you should be able to insulate political decisions from the interests of economic elites.
No, Smith is so clear, and actually, because I actually started really restudying Smith from the point of view of income distribution. No, he says the following also. He says the only class whose incomes with development would go down are capitalists, are employers, because the rate of return on a more plentiful stock, which means more capital, would go down. And he says, consequently, this is not the class whom politicians should listen to, because their interest is not social interest. So you can absolutely draw a straight line in Smith's view that the government policies should be insulated from the plutocratic interest, to use today's terminology. I just don't see how one can, one reads that it's like sentence after sentence of attacks.
I think if you read the first page of Wealth of Nations, it talks about how innovation in the industrial process is often led by workers because they want to work less, and it's not actually led on by technologists or by capital. And I think that's just, again, they kind of lost it. My last question, because we're talking about capitalism, imperialism, China is now a much more assertive, powerful player than the USSR ever was. Are we now in the sort of foothills of a geopolitical, political, and potentially even military conflict between the political West and China?
Well, of course, nobody knows. And I think actually China, let me just disagree on something. I think actually the USSR was more politically assertive than China, because the USSR had an ideology that you can pack together and sell it to Tanzania, to Algeria, to Vietnam, to many countries, Angola, and so on. The problem, or maybe it's a good side, I'm not sure, but with China does not have a sort of a package. The West, the political West, has or had the Washington Consensus. It's a very simple package. You just go with this like 10 rules. You just go to any country, and they are not meaningless rules. Some of them make sense, and you just have the rules. China doesn't have it, and I think the why it doesn't have it is because its own development was the result of many trials and errors and attempts, and actually very pragmatic in some sense. I've actually talked to people in Beijing about that. I said, it seems to me, if you want to have an international influence, you have to create something that a guy with a suitcase from Beijing goes to Dar es Salaam and says, okay, this is what you should do. And they don't have it. So I think their international sort of what the French call a rayonnement is limited, but inability to, out of the China story, to create a story like what should be done. Because if you just go to countries and say, there was like a story of that, use comparative advantage. Well, I am not sure what it means. So I think that maybe they will try to do that. Maybe that's very difficult to do that. Maybe it's also possible that they are not interested. Because China had, as you know, history where it was not particularly interested in sort of telling other countries what to do, but they had distributory system, and you could do whatever you want. I don't care. So I don't know what will happen, but I think that they don't have a sort of 10 principles of economics that are like something that you can sell.
But do you think there's the possibility of conflict? Because, both the United States and China want to be a world leader in AI. They want to capture global markets with regards to consumers for that stuff. They want to be able to get, guarantee supplies of various critical materials. Or do you think that?
I'm what I'm going to say is very sort of not how should I say popular, but I think that the likelihood of conflict between the U.S. and China is less with Trump than with other administrations, and I think for the following reason: I think that Trump is transactional, and I think that Trump's objective is essentially control of the Western Hemisphere, and I think that he would be quite willing to have China play a sort of hegemonic role in Asia. With people who are more focused on human rights and democracy and so on, the problem with China is that they see the regime as illegitimate. Trump doesn't see it as illegitimate because he doesn't care. But I think people who are actually for human rights and democracy see it maybe self-servingly because they want to annoy China, but they see it as an illegitimate regime. If you see somebody as illegitimate, then your relationship with him is a little bit different.
So those are the people that scare you the most in American public life, the people that talk about, an autocratic international and...
Oh, that's, I think, nonsense.
Yeah. Are those the people that scare you more than
Yeah,
Trump?
Yeah, I think actually because they actually are people who lead you towards the war between so-called democracies and so-called autocracies by creating something which doesn't exist. This autocracy, it doesn't exist. China and Russia currently have some interest, but they are like independent players. They are not players within sort of one sort of hegemonic or whatever centralized area. So they're actually and they don't have. And actually, if you look at India, obviously India is not autocratic, but India, well, does have some autocratic tendencies with Modi. But India has its own interests, and even Iran has no. So it's not really that. I think that actually they are pushing in that direction for people to believe that there is some fundamental sort of similarity of geopolitical strategy among these countries, and I don't think that that's true.
We're going to leave it there, Branko.
Okay.
It's a fabulous book.
Okay, thank you very much. I think it's readable, isn't it?
It's very fun to read, Branko. It's very fun to read. You should buy it now. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.